Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm your host, Dan. Today I'm talking about not specifically Saturn retrograde in Aries, but what's on my mind is the fact that we have one of the biggest outer planet alignments in, of the decade happening right now with Saturn and Neptune at this beginning point of Aries, sometimes associated with being a world point, being associated at the very beginning of the cardinal signs. Here you can see this guy representing Two of Wands holding the world. So there's a certain kind of, it's a pivotal moment, I think, when you've got a major conjunction like Saturn and Neptune happening at a degree of the zodiac like this. Similarly, America has recently had its Pluto return, right? And now Pluto is in Aquarius, which is the first decan of Aquarius, is the Five of Swords. And similarly, we also have Uranus and Gemini, the Eight of Swords. This idea of the multiplicity of Gemini, the many, and this kind of like feeling like kind of there's Uranus is a liberatory planet. It stands for freedom and liberation, but this woman who is blindfolded and bound and trapped in this multiplicity of swords does not seem to be very liberated. Actually, and I think, maybe this looks better. This is what we're trying to portray here. These 3 points in sextile and trine. It's almost, you could call this like a kind of a basket kind of pattern anyways. There's something, I was thinking about this one, right? With Pluto in Aquarius, at one point in time, it could be because it's on my mind again, the fact that it's summer and just the vibe of summer makes me think about summer festival season and the ground score. Yes, finding drugs on the ground, but in a more constructive kind of attitude, there's something about Pluto here, which is not just the underworld, illicit substances that may be found laying around, but rather this idea of when is it time to peacefully decide to take a break, peacefully decide to, like call it quits, or peacefully decide, like if you're playing poker or something, to fold your hand, right? And walk away. Or also, you could also consider this like the idea that if you are in the work of building something, of creating something, of like creating some kind of legacy or a monument or something to leave behind to future generations, and even if you lose this battle, who are you leaving this? What's the future generation that you're leaving your stuff for, right? That, like, even if, for example, if you're working on a certain creative project or you're having a certain kind of output, maybe you decide it's time to wind it down, time to call it quits or something like that. But there's still the stuff that you are leaving behind. Maybe somebody else is going to pick up where you left off, and maybe you have some sort of responsibility for whoever is following your footsteps. Maybe you give up that battle. Maybe somebody else is coming to relieve, or like, it's like the position of, like, if you're relieving, somebody's on the watchtower, and you're relieving that person of their position, right? They're walking away from their responsibility, you're picking it up, right? There are these kinds of dynamics, right? There's also the idea of, the challenge of creating astrology videos, there's a challenge basically of what kind of material am I going to be pulling from the current events, the news, or even if I'm talking about my own life, what kind of material am I going to be using to talk about for the kinds of things that I'm recording, right? And there's something about it where I have to admit I've been experiencing a certain degree of self-doubt or hesitation about what kind of material, I feel confident or feel like is my place to get into. And one of these things I would just like to mention first and foremost, that I'm not a journalist, and I'm not trying to give there are a lot of astrologers who I might follow who, to be honest, there's a lot of things going on in the news that I'm not even paying that much close attention to, and I might only find out about it after from listening to somebody else talk about it as astrology forecast or something like that, right? And I'm not really following all that closely, but there's some sort of crossover between paying attention to current events, paying attention to what is already happening, and talking about how the archetypes influence those dynamics versus making predictions of things which may potentially happen in the future, right? And I have to admit that the current dynamic, particularly, I have to admit, a lot of it is influenced by the fact of Uranus into Gemini and the way that activates the Gemini placements of the United States Sibley chart. And I have to admit that, for one thing, I am a Canadian, and it does come, it is what it is. It does come off as awfully, American centric, right? Like, it's a very, from the perspective of America, but not, it's like, the thing is, it's not only just it is what it is. There's also this kind of problem about talking about politics online in these kind of videos. And if I'm not doing it as a journalist, I could still do it from the point of view of an astrologer. But there's just something about the basic nature of the situation that we're dealing with, which inherently feels a bit hairy. Not just the fact that it's we're talking about real, if you're making predictions one way or another, do I really want to be in the game of making predictions about things like war and violence and all sorts of bad stuff, or crime or corruption, or these are all, there's something about this and the Pluto dynamic, which is the corruption and crime or liberation away from that. And there's also just, the problem of, fascism or authoritarianism, or, there's even things going on in the news here in Canada about extremist militia groups and stuff like that, right? And in all of this, I'm still basically, there's the question of whether I am really in it to, the thing is, there's something about all this where you also consider the position of, I don't want to fall into the liberal trap of constantly lampooning myself for being a privileged white guy. But there is a certain kind of privilege that comes with the fact that, this is all, there's something that you look at the stuff through the little screen of your phone, right? There's this there's the attitude of dealing with a situation through the mediated world of the TV, the phone, the media, versus if you are a person who is directly affected by these problems. And to the extent where I do not feel directly affected by these problems, I feel, protected by a certain kind of bubble of privilege, right? But there's this kind of, in the self-awareness of that, I just then there's this okay, so if I'm creating from this position, I don't want to be a smug asshole about it, right? That's firstly. But there's also this kind of I do think there's something very tangibly different about the reality of political problems versus getting stressed out about things happening that you only have contact with through the media. And then also, not even that, but the fact that like there's this there's the problem itself, and then there's whatever subsequent media problem, which is like complaining about like, oh, this person doesn't have the right opinion about it, or this person should be saying more about this, or this less about that, or we need to all focus on this thing. Or I have to admit that over the last, I don't know, week or so, or two, a couple of weeks, and the current climate of things that are going on, oftentimes to me it feels as if it's similar to the phenomenon of watching a cat with a laser pointer, right? Like if you have a laser pointer and you're like making the dot go along the wall, and the cat is just totally fixated on the dot, and like you move it this way, you move it that way, and the cat chases it this way, you cat chases it, and it's sort of like, and then there's this kind of the idea of how like viral media works, where it's like everybody sort of just like it's like the school of fish, or like the herd of like, you know, like when you see all these like the birds that are flying in these massive swarms of like it's like there's this kind of thing where you start to feel like it's just like this kind of dumb mob mentality where it's like, oh, everybody's talking about this, everybody's talking about that, and then it's like this kind of also this sort of like you see this tendency of people who get really into being content creators or media people who make short form content, just reacting to stuff all the time. And there's this kind of inherent kind of like, don't you guys obviously get burnt out, or are you kind of like burning the candle at both ends if you're just going to be like, every single day I have to like respond to whatever is happening as quickly as possible, and just like be caught in this constant reactive, there's this like there's also this whole kind of thing about magic, basically, in the sense of stage magic, where you are often, the way stage magic works is through trying to lead the attention to one thing, and then while all your attention's on that, you could be doing other things where the mechanics of the trick are, which are obscured by misdirecting the attention one way rather than the other, if you see what I'm saying, right? And more often than not, I mean, this isn't to agree with or disagree with the basic whatever it is which may be in the center of the spotlight at every given moment, but you know, the more it seems like there could be this kind of like Wag the Dog approach, where you can like, there's certain things you don't want people talking about. But the thing is that it's also kind of funny when this starts to become this elaborate game where there are maybe all sorts of strange skeletons in closets that you don't want to. I think that this is the kind of the issue. There's something about when you take this one, Pluto, and apply Pluto and Aquarius to it, there's something about like rather than swords on a battlefield that you're picking up after somebody's been defeated and was walked away, it could also be like, what skeleton do you want to drag out of the closet to talk about this time, kind of thing, right? Or like there's some kind of like there's something about the general, like in my. Or you could be like, you know what, instead of making it all about the stuff that's happening at some big global political level, I'm instead going to be focused very personally on my own personal life and just be very, you know, really inhabit my own bubble of privilege. And then whatever it is that's happening in my own hyper isolated, atomized, individualized life, I'm just going to block out everything that's going on in the, you know, all the dramas of the external world, and just like deal with why my own life isn't necessarily satisfying or something like that, right? Which is like, there's something about this which is like, then it becomes instead of being all about what you can, it's kind of interlinked in a way, because the whole point of it is like, in this sort of like situation of feeling kind of isolated or atomized, or it's basically the feeling of being powerless and weak and, you know, having no agency or control. And so whether or not like the whole point of this is like there's certain conflict around whether or not people who are in a position of social status, who are hold some sort of clout or esteem within the social hierarchy, are not using that to certain political ends or whatever. But if you don't have any of that to begin with, then the whole issue is not to criticize the people in that position, but rather why are you in such a weak, impotent position, right? And there's this whole kind of problem about the like you have to then rather than criticize all these things externally going on, then to use the transformative power of, to transform your own shtick, your own project into, to promote, to promote yourself as a person worth taking seriously, so that if anybody did ask you your opinion about this or that political issue, it would actually have an effect on the situation, because your social status is actually worth something in the fact that, in the sense that if you agree with this or disagree with this, it actually matters, right? But if you having the right opinion doesn't actually have, your opinion on anything doesn't actually have any consequence on the situation, it's not really worth very much, is it? Right? I don't know. Maybe this is just a ramble. I'm just expressing this. This is something that's been on my mind recently, and, just sort of wondering whether or not being involved, like there's this question about what am I trying to get at? There's something about this idea of what I'm trying to get at with the privilege thing, where it's like you could consider privilege as a zone of exclusion, right? Whereas, like, for example, the reason why we have ghettos basically is primarily the kinds of people who populate ghettos are excluded from areas which are for the nice, rich, civilized people or whatever, right? And so there's this idea that all the problems are pushed out into another zone, and then when you're in the zone of privilege, you don't have to worry about that stuff, right? And this is basically, I think this is at the root of the problem with the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, is that basically you have one side that's identified, if you listen to their rhetoric, they identify themselves as the defenders of civilization, and as opposed to this other place, which is basically turned into a ghetto, and it is somehow there's a different set of standards for how you treat people who are oppressed in the ghetto versus the civilized people or whatever, right? In this situation, but I have to admit that in my, this is kind of funny, because there's this kind of fluidity in the sense that if I'm in a position where I'm living with my family, then I'm living in an area which it feels privileged, at least in the sense that it's in comparison with other areas which feel more like a ghetto, right? And then if I ever my experience renting places, I've had back before I sort of took some time off of working due to mental health problems, I was renting a place in an area code which has the reputation as being the poorest area code in Canada, right? And there's this kind of at that time, I was working a job that was not really that much better than minimum wage, and dealing with the economic pressure in the post, the post financial crisis era, where the cost of living was getting increasingly worse and worse and worse, and your boss is increasingly more and more stingy about paying good wages, and you're living in the poorest area where there's full of crime and drugs and all this kind of stuff. It sucks, right? But the thing is about this is that, like, when you're living in the suburbs in a comparatively nicer area, and you're Canadian, and also this idea that all the problems with the conflicts of the world, I mean, yeah, I shouldn't get, like, there are in areas neighboring which there may be more crime and there may be more stuff like that. But it creates a situation where through the small window of your TV or your phone or your computer, you're peering out into the world of all this stuff going on, where there is war, there's crime, there is all the crazy stuff with ICE going on in the United States. There's all this kind of stuff. Or even, I don't know, in other provinces, there may be certain extremist groups or something like that. There's all sorts of, there's this climate of fear and paranoia and chaos and all this kind of stuff. But what's odd about this is that it seems to reinforce the idea that you live, or at least I live, in a very privileged circumstance, and that there's some kind of protective bubble, and that the media acts as to mediate, in the word media being connected to the middle, to be in the middle of something, to be in between, right? To be in between you and your privileged life and the chaotic world of, all this crazy shit that's going out there in the world. There is the media as mediator, right? Or you could also think about it where there's this sort of like, the normalcy that exists in your ordinary life, but these places which are either ghettos or war zones or places where are basically zones where those rules do not apply. There's a different order at play in these zones, which are the forces of destruction are just running rampant, chaos and destruction and all this kind of stuff. This is kind of a lead up to talking about a number of things. Mainly, I have some physical media here. 3 years ago, I recorded a video about this movie, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, and I was using it as a reference for Neptune in astrology. And just more recently, I have read this book called Roadside Picnic, which is the book version of which this movie is based. And first of all, I think that although I was talking about Pluto, well, I think this kind of goes with a number of things, right? First of all, I was talking about Pluto and Aquarius, this card representing the first decan of Aquarius. I was talking about Saturn and Neptune in Aries, this card representing the first decan of Aries. And there's something about, first of all, just to be very upfront, if you just listen to what other astrologers have to say about some of these transits and the kinds of concerns about some of the more negative things, with something like Saturn and Neptune, there is this concern around nuclear stuff, right? And there is topically, the Stalker was interesting because it seemed to, it was made before the Chernobyl incident, and yet it seemed to predict the Chernobyl incident. And there's also, it deals heavily with like shooting on location in places where there is rampant industrial waste to such an extreme degree that Tarkovsky himself and many of his crew members became seriously ill from shooting on very polluted locations, right? And because of this, I have to admit that this movie has sort of takes on an aura of being sort of like this inscrutable artistic masterpiece. But then I never even considered, well, it was only until recently that I bothered reading the original book, which is very different for a number of reasons. Particularly, one of the things about Tarkovsky that I like is that in an era when it seems that everybody's attention span is basically shot to shit and nobody can pay attention to anything for very long, Tarkovsky's movies seem like they're the perfect antidote for this, in that they're like, it's basically, what's interesting about the Roadside Picnic in contrast though, is that, Roadside Picnic, it's like there's maybe a quarter or a third of this book, which is not even a very long book, is basically stretched out it's like as if you took a very select scenes from that book and then zoomed in on them with a microscope, right? Or like just like took certain moods, took certain affects, took certain vibes of that were present, and then just like stretched it out and made it really long and made it very like just vibed out on it, right? And I think that's what's interesting about Tarkovsky, anyways, is that he puts the atmosphere and the vibe of it ahead of the plot or the story, and in such a way that when you actually read Roadside Picnic, there's the stuff that feels like it takes forever in Stalker, goes by really quickly, and then there's a lot of other plot that's just that's more of the story, right? That is, that gives the very different picture from what the little bits you're shown in Stalker, right? And so in light of this, there's something that's interesting to me, that if you think about the way that people typically do, like I'm talking about this in terms of astrology because I used Stalker in a video 3 years ago as a reference point to talk about Neptune, basically on this idea of transcendence, right? And I have to admit that oftentimes I somehow think that it was sort of, I don't know, I can say that my idea around this has been changing, or that maybe I'm just looking back on that video I made 3 years ago, and like, I don't want to use something about recording this right now. I don't want to call it cringe and just say, oh, I just made a cringe video that wasn't very good. And then I tried watching a little bit of it and I'm like, oh, it's not that bad. But there's something about this basic idea of like Neptune as this transcendent, you're yearning for union with the transcendent or something like that. But it's like, it's an illusion or something like this, right? And like trying to apply that to Stalker. And it's sort of like, in retrospect, it seems kind of like a lame thing, right? And feel like I've progressed beyond that. However, there's in some way it does apply. If you apply, instead of talking about transcendent, what if you just adapt this a little bit? What if we talk about the beyond, to be now we got Saturn and Neptune together, to be beyond a certain border, to beyond a certain boundary, or that there's this idea that there's this zone that exists beyond the, like, if we are in privilege, if we're in this privileged bubble container of a privileged environment, there are these zones that exist beyond that, right? And there's this idea that like you don't want to stay in the zone and camp out there forever, but you can make these journeys into the zone and then come back or whatever, right? But what is odd though is that there's something about the way that the media works, where the media is not really out. The very media is present in this bubble of privilege, acting as a little window or a messenger or a communicator for what is there outside the bubble of privilege, right? But there's this idea that like there's something about like, even if I'm just going to be like, okay, so I'm going to use the media to put something out there into the world, right? And that in my own life, I'm in this protected bubble of privilege where it's all just a bunch of crazy shit out there that apparently doesn't have any effect, very little effect or influence on my grounded lived life or something like that. There's this sort of thing of like, is by taking, if you are like going, you see what I'm saying, right? Like it's like there's stuff that you're like, oh, well, maybe I could like venture into one of these sort of like off these zones which are outside of my privileged existence, and that there are certain things that I could acquire from that zone, right? And then in this book, there's also funny because the climax of both Stalker and Roadside Picnic is the acquisition of an item from the zone called the Golden Sphere, right? Which is in name, that's very similar to the Golden Dome, right? That Trump talks about, right? And there's a sort of idea that like, in this sort of bubble of privilege of this is me as just a, you know, insulated, atomized white guy in this privileged suburbs, you know, never mind if I'm renting, or either that, or I should go, you know, this is kind of annoying having to live here. I should just go rent a place, but everything's expensive, so I'll end up in the ghetto. And then pretty soon, you know, just play that out until you don't feel so privileged anymore, right? Or else you know, or else you could stay in this position and then, you know, use, okay, well, if I'm going to, you know, what I'm trying to say, there's this is a basic feeling of the way that the zone in Stalker was literally like kind of not, I don't know if it was actually radioactive, but it was a toxic, literally a toxic, polluted environment, but had a detrimental effect on people. And there's this kind of thing of like, oh, well, look, if we just look at all these things going on in terms of, let's say, you know, extremist militias, or, you know, weird, you know, let's say crime organizations, or like, let's say, you know, different, how this interfaces with politics and blackmail, or else, you know, there's also, I also have to admit that there's this kind of dynamic when it comes to aliens and UFOs that I have to admit that I'm going to just confess that rather than having any real legitimate direct experiences with this, it's just a certain kind of thing of, you know, it's like often, it's like, I think it maybe is related to astrology in that you're bored and you're gazing up in the sky and you're wondering and you're like, what if, you know, life is so dull, and, you know, it's like, it's this kind of thing where it's like, you could be, you know, in the safety bubble of privilege, you dream of like the UFOs flying around to make life more interesting because everything's so dull and boring. But then there's this sort of like, there's this way about like, we see all this stuff as being like, we'll bring this back to astrology, right? Bring this back to astrology video. You could be like, okay, so Saturn and Neptune, that's like, this overly skeptical attitude that dismisses the reality of UFOs or aliens, or dismisses things like psychic powers, or, you know, anything woo-woo and new age and stuff like that. Or else you could be like, and then Pluto, this is kind of funny when you combine Pluto and Aquarius with that. It's like you're recovering something that has been left behind, right? Now, this thing about bringing Roadside Picnic into this is that what you have in the basic plot mechanism of this book is that aliens have visited planet Earth, left in the places where they stayed, and they've left behind all sorts of strange pollutants and strange materials or items that we may not even know what they are, but there can be recovered, and there's a kind of a black market demand for all these leftover materials. And in this whole kind of thing, there is this other kind of conversation about UFO stuff, and about like, if are UFOs, there's this question that there was, you know, there's something I feel like was really telling back when we were having the mystery drone invasion of New Jersey and other parts of the United States back in December of 2024. One of the guys made the statement saying that there were no drones because they were all manned aircraft, right? And that as technology develops, it's entirely reasonable that you may have experimental manned aircraft that are not publicly advertised, that maybe somebody captures on their phone. So like, you could have some sort of experimental aircraft that somebody's flying around and somebody gets a picture of it. Doesn't mean it's from outer space. Doesn't mean it's aliens. It could just be a secret project. But then there's the thing about like the whole, you know, that whole X-Files Roswell kind of plot line of like, what if there are alien things that have been recovered, and that what if people are reverse engineering alien technology? And this is actually a big plot line in Roadside Picnic that doesn't, like, it's also there in Stalker, but it's kind of like not in the foreground so much. But the thing is, so you've got this thing about like you know, whether I'm in this zone of privilege and I'm going into all these forbidden areas to talk about whether this is Epstein, or whether this is Israel, or whether this is UFO shit, or whether this is, you name it. And it's just like, this is all just stuff that's outside. This is not my business. Why should I even bother with this? I should just be a privileged white guy, not even think about it, and just think about what would be good for getting my my own social status up, so people take me seriously as somebody whose opinion matters, or something like that, right? But no, what it said, no, there's this whole thing, and there's this other conversation about, like, you know, psychic stuff. There's a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes, things like that. But in Roadside Picnic, the plot line is that the people who go into the zone to recover the materials get their genes mutated by the pollution of the zone, and then they are forever mutated, and then their children come out as mutants, and then with Tarkovsky includes this in Stalker at the very end of it. His mutant daughter uses telekinesis to move a glass and knock it off the table like a cat. You know, or like a cat would push it off the table. It's like the kid is using mind powers to move the glass, kind of thing, right? And in Roadside Picnic, this isn't just like, this isn't a these aren't separate things. They're all interconnected through the mechanism of the story, right? Where the psychic stuff is a side effect of the venturing into the zone to get the materials, and they're the black market. It's all part and parcel of a certain thing, right? But another thing about this I thought was interesting is that there's certain kinds of, like, the idea of being like, this going back to this idea of transcendence versus immanence, or being grounded or being ungrounded, or being sober or intoxicated, that kind of stuff, right? There's this whole thing about it where it's like, there's some kind of irony. I'm remembering a while back, I hung out with a friend I hadn't seen in a while, who had experience with AA and all this kind of stuff. And for some reason, I was talking about how, like, I've actually been, since the pandemic, I stopped drinking, but then I've been indulging in some of the legal marijuana, which is a local industry where I live here in Canada, supporting the local economy or whatever around my cannabis consumption. But I kind of made this thing where I was saying, I was like, there are certain movies, I guess there's certain movies anyways that have a serious kind of atmosphere to them. And that I was kind of saying that, like, you know, it's like maybe certain times getting stoned, it's like there's a certain kind of, like, you know, Scooby-Doo giggly kind of like you just want to, like, not be so serious. You want to, like, watch some Saturday morning cartoons, or you want to, it's like you want to have this, like, but there's something about where it's like that kind of, it feels like you're in that state of mind and you're trying to watch, like, Tarkovsky movies. It doesn't like go with each other with it, right? Like, you need to be in this sort of, like, serious, sober state of mind. And then in contrast, to read Roadside Picnic, there's something that stood out to me in that there's so much addiction and alcoholism in Roadside Picnic, right? And I think, I mean, you could attribute that kind of alcoholism or addiction to being like the atmosphere of, like, Russia, or, like, you know, these Russian guys who drink a lot of vodka or something. Or there's something about, there's something about what happened with the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union and all the crime and just bad stuff in Eastern Europe, that it's, you know, it's not just that, you know, oh, because you're Russian, you like to drink a lot or something like that. There's some kind of, like, legitimately shitty like, especially when there's this whole rhetoric thing. You remember when Donald Trump used to say things like shithole countries? There's this idea that being in a privileged environment, there's some expectation that life is good, and that if life isn't good, if life is depressing, we have the tendency to blame ourselves. I'm just a privileged white guy in a privileged community, and why isn't everything, like, I'm entitled to have everything great because we live in a free liberal society where, you know, I've got the silver spoon in my mouth, and it's just like my own narcissist depression. Why would have any problem, right? As opposed to all these oppressed people in other places, right, where there's actual legitimate problems when people have actually had legitimate oppression and trauma, then you can, then having a addiction problem is maybe more understandable, right? There's something about there's something about this Roadside Picnic which is interesting, because in the introduction, Ursula K. Le Guin points out that the actual specific story, they don't say what country it's set in. And actually, the plot line of Roadside Picnic is that there are multiple spots, there are multiple zones across the world. And so what it's implied is that there may be a number of different governments who all have the same problem, who are all dealing with it in their own way. And that whether it's the same way that if you compare it to like a science fiction movie like Alien or something, you've got like in Alien, you've got corporate mining ships, right? Now, if you think about something like outer space mining, and you could think about this in a way that's highly corporatized, or you could think of it like imperial, like, Star Wars. You've got the Empire, right? You've got, essentially, you can have the exact, very, very similar operation. You have mining happening, and in one situation, it's mining that is administrated by the Empire in Star Wars, and you're getting raw materials to build Imperial Star Cruisers out of, or, like to fuel your engine, your star, your warp speed engines. Maybe you need fuel and you're having a resource management operation. Or else you could have the same thing as a private corporation. And, from the perspective of the guy working as the miner, maybe the difference between whether this is a private corporation or whether this is an empire or whether this is a communist, authoritarian, regime, or whatever politics is of the people in charge of your mining operation, it may not actually make much of a damn difference for the actual person who's like there in the damn midst of it working the job, except for obviously in my own history, my grandfather was a miner and he was, he unionized, right? And so there's a certain inherent, a certain kind of union, the main issue about a free society is that you're supposed to be able to unionize. Whereas if you're an imperial society, you're going to get clamped down on by the empire, right? Or if your corporation operates like a monarchy or an empire, there's not really much of a fucking difference, right? That's like the whole Curtis Yarvin trip, basically, right? But aside from that, what's interesting about this is that they don't put the politics front and center, and instead they kind of imply that this could be a neutral situation regardless of the politics, but there is still this, due to basically there's a traumatic nature of the thing, because going in there to get the materials is hazardous, right? There's a certain hazard that comes with the work. And this has actually been an inspiration for divination, in the sense that, instead of me going into a territory to get something, it's like I'm creating content and then putting that out there into the world for public consumption. And then it's kind of like the reverse, is that I'm in some sort of privileged bubble and I get to create some content and be like, hey guys, this is me. I'm living this isolated lifestyle as a privileged white guy. And I don't have actually any, I'm not going to give you journalism about what's going on here, there, or other places, because I don't have any fucking clue. I'm only, I'm only just getting that on the news anyways. And all this whole process basically works to reinforce this idea that it's a scary, chaotic, dangerous world out there. And you better count your lucky stars that you're a privileged white guy. And a good thing that we have a strong military and police force to keep us safe in the suburbs from all these scary, people from other countries and, and all this kind of stuff. And there's this kind of and that if you want to talk, there's the danger isn't really, I don't know. I mean, I guess, you could be more, I could be more of there's this kind of thing about the zone of venturing outside the walls of your little insular privileged bubble of privilege, security, and I don't know, maybe there's just certain limits from how much I can do within the structure of the situation that I'm given. But there's nonetheless this whole kind of there's this dynamic where it feels like there's a plenty of different topics to draw on, but they all have this quality of what I would describe as feeling like they're radioactive, in that, if you and I would compare this to I play this game Elden Ring, and in Elden Ring there is an area called Caelid, which has been corrupted by the Scarlet Rot. And there's this, and I've I'm kind of slow with this game. I've encountered, first of all, I had this problem called like Elden Wrist, where I felt like I was getting arthritis from playing Elden Ring. And then I got over that, and then I started experiencing Elden Ring fatigue, where after making some progress and defeating a few bosses, I just get tired of this game. And I play it but anyways, I made it to the Lake of Rot and the Land of the Giants, and I still haven't gotten to the expansion pack yet. But there's this like thing in there where it's like the toxic area, where the basic premise is places where the natural flow, the flow has been obstructed and things are stagnating, and in this stagnation, that's like a kind of this bacterial fungus mold that turns everybody into weird like red bug people and stuff like that, and it's all creepy or whatever, right? It feels like there's like, oh, okay, well, if I can have the option to either, talk about my own personal life as a isolated, privileged white guy who plays video games and, follows the astrology and does tarot cards. Or else I could talk about what's going on in the world, which is all sorts of things to do with, crime, cover-ups, blackmail, conspiracies, extortion, maybe even some aliens thrown in there, maybe some weird cults, who knows, right? But it's like, it has this feeling to me of like, in Roadside Picnic, one of the substances or one of the things that exist in the zone is hell slime, right? And if you touch the hell slime or get it on you, you're fucked basically, right? And so like there's this kind of thing that like it feels like the internet is basically you exist in your little bubble of privilege, and then basically the media environment is like a bunch of people who are reporting to you on the various varieties of hell slime that exist in these bizarre ghetto zones, or like places of, where destruction and abuse and crazy, sadomasochistic power dynamics run rampant. And you're just like, oh shit, I don't want to get any of this fucking hell slime on me, man. Like I don't want to get into that and then get radioactive and be like, oh my God, and I need to instead create this dynamic to reinforce the walls of my protective bubble of privilege, so that I make sure that fucking shit is on the other side of the wall, and that I can take responsibility that there ain't none of that shit going on my own, where I can take responsibility for, right? But then you can kind of see how that structure then creates this sort of thing about like it reinforces xenophobia, or like it's like basically you're just inhabiting this structure where you're like pearl clutching, like, oh dear, I don't know what to do about things in the world, but we'll just count our lucky stars, guys, and I guess we'll just make positive affirmations about things and not talk about anything that's bad. And then like it's just kind of like, I guess we're lucky. I guess we're the privileged ones. But let's just not talk about anything, because if we do talk, we'll get the hell slime on us, and then we'll be fucked. And then pretty soon we'll realize that there's the barrier, or like, I don't know, that if you then, the more you focus on not the world dynamic, but your own personal dynamic, it's like, oh, I just have to make sure I can produce my own, self. I can produce myself as a entrepreneur, as a businessman, in such a way that I don't fall into the ghetto. Because then if I'm just living in the poorest neighborhood, surrounded by crime and drugs, and then like what actually, how much are you gonna, like, how much faith do you put on the barrier that exists between you and the drug addict, the criminal, the homeless person, the person on the street? Like, do you think, what makes you think that you're so much better than them, and that you were not just going to get sucked into some kind of shitty dynamic out of exposure to that, right? But it also creates this kind of underlying this is kind of once you add COVID to the mix of this, there's also this dynamic that all these people may actually also be literally contaminated with disease. And that this is Victorian mentality where it's like, oh, if I mix with the wrong crowd, not only is it bad for like moral depravity, but I'm also at risk of contracting an illness, from and then that I'm going to be contaminated by all the by the being, so it's in my best interest that I just really reinforce this privilege thing, right? And I think, I don't know. These are some thoughts and ideas on my mind. I thought I would express it. I don't know. This is how I'm relating to the current situation anyways. Hopefully you guys like this one. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Tune in next time. Thanks for watching.